I'm doing all right. Yourself?
Pretty good, pretty good. I don't know, it's a whirlwind, but I think I'm kind of caught up on grading and
Damn, cool.
I've got to kind of get my butt in gear to write a new chapter of my
Hmm.
my ancient medieval world history. I'm up to, yeah, a third of the way through roughly. I guess this will be
Hmm.
going into week 7, so we're almost halfway through now that I think of it. And I am just killed off Caesar last
Okay.
last this last week, and so so we're at so we've got the whole that whole
Cool.
probably only it's kind of weird because I went from covering big swaths of millennia,
Yeah.
earlier on to I think in this last chapter I only did 300 years or so, and this one I'll be lucky
Hmm.
to get through 2 or 300 years in the 10,000 words or so that I have to you know to, sp-
Yeah.
to spend on a lecture. So yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Cool.
yeah, yeah. So I've got Cleopatra and that whole thing,
Okay.
and the Civil War and the beginning of the empire. But then I've got the whole
Okay.
rest of the world, right? So
Yeah.
sort of the
It
the
yeah, that's the piece. The rest of the world piece is kind of where like the last 8 years or so I've been back digging.
mm,
And part of it was took my last semester of undergrad in England at the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies.
cool.
And it was the whole the Renaissance more or less starting on, in 1453 with the fall of
Oh,
Constantinople,
Constantinople, sure. Yeah.
and they no longer had access to, all the learnings and all the progress that happened,
Hmm.
in Mina out through, Silk Road.
Right, right. And they had that
And
kind of diaspora
yeah,
of teachers and books. Yeah.
yeah. And
Into
it's
Eastern
just
Europe. Yeah.
like that whole side was a mystery. And picking up the Violet Mahler Map of Knowledge, that was a phenomenal book.
Mm,
And I had made many attempts to try to understand that other side of Constantinople from time, from cultures, and so forth. And I just could not keep the name straight. And
mhm.
Muller's book, it's Moller, and she's at the Bodleian Library in
Oh, okay.
Oxford.
Cool. Thank you.
But just trying to keep the name straight, and it gave me a hook to keep the name straight and taking notes. And but it just completely was breaking my precepts and prejudices for
Hmm.
understanding how things happened.
Right.
And it was just like I would read pieces and I'm like, I gotta go for some long walks. This is gonna
Hmm.
be a while. And was reading it like an hour at a time while my son was doing training for basketball, and just sitting outside the gym for personal training stuff.
Hmm.
And I was just like, and then I would just think, just
Hmm.
like,
Yeah.
okay, this just like flipped everything. It flipped things, but then just opened everything up. I'm like, there is so much more out there.
Hmm.
And then on the way back from his workout, be talking to him about it. So he got hooked by me just like vocalizing what I was reading and just like where I was struggling. And so
Hmm.
what when he got to college, the history class he chose was a history of Mina from 1500 forward. And then he sent me everything, like all the materials from his class, because he was talking about things and he's like, "Hey, do you know about this?" I'm like,
Hmm.
"I do not."
Right. That
It was
is,
kind of cool.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, it's weird because, hey, Chris, it's weird because something came up that hadn't really occurred to me that much, or it hadn't been something that I focused on when we read Debt, the first 5,000 years. But when I was talking about the Axial Age a couple weeks ago,
Hmm.
and um, there was a woman who was doing kind of a review of what Graeber had said about the axial age in Debt.
Huh.
And so it was
Okay.
it was sort of, about, it wasn't totally about the whole, book of Debt, but it was about that element of it. And one of the things that came out that I hadn't really sort of focused on quite as much, I guess, when we were reading that, and we did it in the book club, and I had read it previously, and it had never really occurred to me in quite as strong a way that the the dark ages, the quiet periods,
Yeah.
were potentially very liberating for common people. Right. And so
Yeah.
this is a time when you don't have a lot of elite record keeping and
Yep.
documentation of stuff that is
Yep.
the stuff of, the archival stuff that historians want to go and see. And yet maybe life is much better for the people who don't, you know, most of the time end up in those archives anyway. So I thought
Yeah.
that was kind of an interesting sort of insight.
Cool.
And maybe that relates a little bit to the section here that we're going to read on, so what do we do about it? Because I think the so
Yeah.
what do we do about it is quite a bit about, sort of regular people.
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to stuff.
Yeah.
I was listening to some reactions. I think it was even like Jimmy Dore was reacting
Huh.
to Larry Ellison's ownership of TikTok, in
Yeah.
very, kind of over the top, in the way that only, Jimmy Dore can. Although actually that's not even true anymore. There are plenty of people who are taking the same interpretive approach, and even sometimes the same style nowadays.
Yeah.
So there seems to be a lot of anxiety that, maybe we would have been better off if the Chinese, who really don't have any way aside from making consumer products to control us,
Yeah.
were the keepers of that data, and not, Larry Ellison, who, there's a
Yeah.
million clips of him, dreaming about what a great world it's going to be when, because we're watching you, you have to behave better.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. 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 This week's reading where it got into the creepy, I found to be very funny because it's like around 2011 was framing things out for social networks, other things, and had mentioned to a marketing person, communication person that I was working with around projects. And she's like, this sort of sounds creepy. I'm like, no, framing it this way so that it's not creepy. And I'm like, you're, being transparent. And it's like, we've been non-creepy since X year.
Mhm.
And she's like, we need to put that on our website for the projects.
Well, it's all
Like,
is it kind of like this is the modern technological version of holding your hand out and shaking hands with someone with your sleeves up to show them you don't have a knife, you're not holding a knife.
yeah,
Like
Yeah.
this is, you know, there are small subtle things we do culturally like that either help or improve or push the economy. So we
yep,
take it for granted here in America that you can walk into Walmart and there are 2 million SKUs on shelves that you can pick up and touch and handle. And very, very little of it broadly is behind glass or you need help to get.
Mhm.
yeah,
Whereas there are some Middle Eastern countries where things are still back behind a thing, and you have to ask the shopkeeper to get the thing
yeah,
down to look at it.
Mhm.
And to do that at scale for every customer that walks in is a huge hurdle that slows that commerce down. And
Yeah.
whether
yeah,
you can argue separately whether speeding commerce up is a good or a bad thing,
Yeah.
from
The
a
closest, it's funny, the
yeah,
closest target to me is kind of in what they call the midway between Minneapolis and St. Paul. And it's a very urban, kind of
hmm,
industrial rundown area. And I went in to get, like, when I had just moved here, I went to get an electric toothbrush, not an expensive one, a cheap one. And I had to find somebody to let me in the cage. And then I ended up buying a pink one because I just felt so rushed. It's like, okay, I just grabbed the first one that was, right there. And so I started actually going farther to a slightly more suburban
Hmm.
not ghetto Target,
Hmm.
where nothing is behind
Yeah.
plexiglass. So it's a weird thing.
Well, and it happened
And
mostly, I think, because of the pandemic. A lot of stores were seeing huge losses walk
yeah.
out the door. So even one of my local grocery stores still has, they put end cap plastic barriers around the two drug aisles
Hmm.
or drug store aisles within the grocery store
Yeah,
and set up a cash register there. So you go in, you shop those two aisles, and you pay for what you get before you leave that section.
right.
Hmm.
Which,
It's
you
weird
know,
that the whole, I mean, that whole people running out of CVS's, and I mean, we were for a
Yeah.
while, they were kind of, I mean, it was sort of pandemic, sort of George Floyd aftermath, right? That it was like,
Hmm.
oh, below $1,000, we're not gonna press charges anymore. So how does a Walgreens or a CVS even stay in business? Um,
Yeah.
so it's just, yeah, it's weird.
well, and the other
Yeah.
thing too that's shifty there is most grocery stores at least in America operate on razor thin margins. They're literally making pennies per
Right.
thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And it's the loss of the drugstore items, which have higher margins
sure.
generally because it's not the grocery stores competing against grocery stores, but when they add those stuff in those aisles, they don't compete with other grocery stores selling that stuff. They're competing with the drugstore selling that stuff.
Right. Well,
So,
Yeah.
and also, how many heads of cabbage are you going to try to run out of the store with?
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it's a weird, but it's a weird, quirky little,
Hmm.
those subtle little everyday things that you don't think about that either speed up the economy or slow it down, or things like cameras, maybe they are surveilling us, but at the same
Yeah.
time, we are given the power to surveil them.
Hmm. Yeah.
The difference is the everyday Joe needs, or Josephine needs their siren server to put all that data on that they can then re-extract data out of. And it's one of the things that we don't see government doing that service for us of,
Not here.
you know, protecting us. And broadly too, the one thing that strikes me in reading this and a few of the other things is the cultural differences broadly between the US and Europe, whereas, Americans generally have trusted the government in the past and Europe broadly doesn't, or they're much more skeptical of what it is and what it does or what it can do for them. And maybe what Trump is doing now is throwing us into the other end of being massively, the far right has always been distrustful of government.
Hmm. Yeah.
And now with what this administration is doing, the far left and the center are being trained to not trust the government at all. Like what they say means nothing because, it's just all lies.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. There's some.
we're being justified and brought to the same page as the far right.
But what
Um,
about the
Yeah.
trust that Europeans seem to have? Because you're saying that Europeans traditionally have had less trust in their governments than we maybe traditionally have, and maybe that's changing. But what about this whole idea of allowing the type of surveillance and the type of penalizing people for mean tweets and things like that are going on in England? And yeah, remember that 60 Minutes episode about Germany and how the police were just so delighted to be going and hassling some dude for saying something nasty on some social media app.
well, and to me, that's one of the things is when the postal system costs money to send a letter or something through it, the value of the communication goes up. So you don't get as much junk mail because it costs something to send it. And you see the same thing in all the big fax server farms
Hmm.
that would I actually had an office next door to a company, and the guy was like, "Yeah, we need a 1% response rate to the 8 million faxes a day we send out
Right.
to be in pure profit.
Right.
He's like, and generally we're getting a 2 or 3% response rate.
So
So
they're
yeah, he's like,
yeah.
we send out 1 billion faxes to all kinds of crazy,
Uh-huh.
and the cost of it is not insignificant, but we make so much because the response rate is high enough.
Uh-huh.
And it was like, okay, but in social media spaces, it's incredibly free for me to send messages or messages at scale.
Uh-huh.
And there's no friction on the social consequences because on the internet, everybody's a dog.
Right.
Um,
Right. Well, and the
so what
filtering that allows
if
you
there
to
were
do.
consequences, the same thing that might hold true if you said it about policing in America. There are pretty much zero consequences for police officers socially and emotionally taxing the people that they stop and frisk and do whatever they want to do with. There's zero consequence, and
Uh-huh.
because of that, it becomes a massive tax. And that tax is now gone to the highest level, where you see a sitting president actively taxing a former head of the FBI by indicting him. And this morning I wake up and the first headline I see is, "Oh, we want to do a perp walk." Like, that is a social, emotional, and legitimate tax to waste this poor guy's time to do all this crap for what ostensibly, based on what I've read and the charges, there's no way this guy is, you know, but he may go through 2 months of trial crazy as a tax
Uh-huh.
just for the exercise.
Uh-huh.
But where is the cost to the system or the administration for doing
Yeah.
these activities?
Yeah.
And
And
and some of the cost in other countries, it may cost you a couple $100 to file a lawsuit in the US, but there's no negative consequence for bringing frivolous lawsuits. Whereas in other countries, if you bring a lawsuit against the person and you lose, you have to pay all the costs,
right.
which gives a little more justice to the
Right.
people who can't.
Which goes all the way back to Hammurabi, right? If you bear false witness, then
Hmm.
the penalty applies to you. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, but in reading for this session, by quirk, right all the way back to the beginning of what this session was covering, um,
We started at 19 this week, right?
it struck me.
16.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
16. Okay.
I was back
Roughly.
at
I kind
20
of
or
started at
21,
19
something
too.
like that. The thing that jumped out at me for that was things like a no-fly list,
Uh-huh.
and amongst, and we've also in the past spoken about that guy who got fed up with the FBI pulling him out of line. He just wrote everything he was doing down and made it a blog, whose name escapes me at the moment. But the couple of things that popped out of the no-fly list and the misuse of the people who have having trouble for no real reason. Billy Pat Stevens, who's now Yusuf, whatever his name
Yep.
is a problem. Yet the woman who is the wife of a senator called Catherine Stevens has exactly the same problem as Cat Stevens, right? And
That's how sophisticated our systems are.
you jump on to, there's a Wikipedia page about problems of no-fly lists, and there's a good 20, 30 people who are clearly not terrorists, because the no-fly list was something like 25 people before 9/11,
Uh-huh.
and now it's like 5,000 plus. And they're talking of it, there's even talk of it being 20 to 30, 40,000. And when other people have been pushing to see why am I on the list, a lot of the time it's, there's Ted Kennedy, Senator Ted Kennedy got on it because apparently he called George W. an idiot.
Yeah.
Now
Well, and
that
Tulsi
that
Gabbard got
means
on the
I'm not
quiet
even going to
skies
get on
list
a
because she
that's
insulted
going to
Kamala.
mean that I'm not even going to get on a bus, given the current situation.
Yeah.
And it struck me that there's elements of, and particularly with the no-fly list, one of the ways of getting yourself on the no-fly list is to ask, why am I on the no-fly list? So it's a very 1984
Mhm.
problemo.
Right.
And
Or to be too curious about the existence of a no-fly list.
yeah.
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 And it reminds me way back when Dad's first trip to what was then the Soviet Union, my younger sister told a teacher, Dad's a spy and he's in the Soviet Union. We ended up with a visit from Special Branch. And it's the combination of, and of course, at the moment, there's all this conversation of how comes you're not a good German who was against Hitler? Why are you all accepting the current regime? And automatically, there's just some school kid mentions to somebody, we don't even know whether it was the teacher or another parent, because one of her friends said something.
Right.
And that was like, at best, it was like 3 days it took. And there's no electronics involved outside of a telephone.
Right.
And I thought the bit where he's talking about things like the no-fly list and the commercial symmetry, where you go from Providence to the commercial symmetry, as in and we've spoken about it before in several instances, when you've got your book on your Kindle, you don't own it. Whereas if you buy a book, physical book, even from Amazon, you still own the physical book.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's like, as soon as we make things wholly and completely electronic, the ability to tamper without it being showing up that easily, at which point it comes back to Cambridge Analytica and Brexit and all the rest of it, how that seemingly rolled over into a very unexpected result. And even now, the people who managed to manipulate that are still manipulating it. As of this year, Nigel Farage is still the most on BBC television.
Okay, you need to take a break so that we can respond to this stuff before you develop more ideas, Tim. So I do think that you've brought up a really interesting thing about the whole subscription model, the whole rent versus buy, I mean, and in business, that's software as a service, right? I mean, that's that whole thing that software companies
over it
did over the last couple of decades.
And it goes a bit on about the information economy is so evolved on its present track, as a quote. It's without particular extreme violence, is the 3.5% number that's being researched going to be enough to actually be able to push a change?
Yeah. So the whole thing. I mean, that was the thing that and I did sort of start in chapter 19, but the thing that I had highlighted there was his idea about market forces, and his sort of contention that market forces would, I mean, it was almost like a libertarian sort of a thesis,
Hmm.
right? That this was going to work better somehow. This was going to be more it was going to be better alignment, And there's plenty of people nowadays who have just
But
sort of internalized that.
but we got cured of markets, didn't we, when we did the big myth? How easy is it for, particularly when there is a major size small group of players, that you know the the government in that context, you're breaking up monopolies, doesn't seem to be their job anymore.
Hmm. Right,
The monopolization of the TV channels and the press,
right.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and
You
that
know,
that does
I mean,
give them opportunities to
otherwise we
control,
would
right?
have a yeah, but otherwise we'd have a nice, easy time with the TV and none of this Jimmy Kimmel rubbish.
Well, but the thing that allowed that job owning to possibly be very effective was that one of the affiliate networks was in the middle of a merger or a acquisition, really is what it was,
Yeah, about to.
that was about to violate all kinds of antitrust
Yeah.
laws, right, that are on the books, and they needed special dispensation in order to hold those aside or wipe them away and allow them to do this thing that was blatantly illegal by the way that we've understood,
Mm.
concentration of power in the broadcasting business up until this point, right? So
Yeah.
so the fact that government gets to be involved in that does give them some type of power, right? Oh, I'm
A huge
Yeah.
amount of power
But
because
you've
they're
got,
talking
yeah,
about the broadcast coverage cap has been 39 point something percent for a couple decades now.
yeah,
Mhm.
And they want to buy enough stations that they're going to have 80% coverage in America,
yeah. You've
which
got,
is a huge, huge
What could
shift
possibly go
in
wrong?
yeah,
media content.
the two that
Well,
were
how we
doing
get
it
our
were,
media now has changed too,
yeah,
but
yeah, because Sinclair already blew through that cap and they got the dispensation, and the other firm was trying to purchase to get close to what Sinclair or past Sinclair,
Hmm.
and it's just. And the funny part was, is the two of them were pushing really strongly, and not only did Kimmel come back, but within 2 additional days, he came back to the networks that started the whole thing. And
Oh, did they
because
take them
they're,
back finally, the affiliates?
yeah,
Okay, because that was
they're,
news for a moment that they weren't. Yeah.
yeah, the local advertisers were getting a whole lot of heat, and they're like, "We want Jimmy Kimmel." They were like, "We don't care. We will find it. We'll find it online or elsewhere." And the local stations are like, "Hello,
Hmm.
hello, upstairs. We got serious problems.
Right.
Um, you may have overstepped what you thought you could do."
Hmm.
And so there was just insane pushback from the people who just want to sit on their sofa and watch, Kimmel at night, and that keeps them happy.
Right.
I'm like,
or whether they do or not. I only occasionally watch Kimmel, but I canceled Disney Plus and Hulu and
Well,
still
it's funny.
still haven't gone back. It's going to be a while.
It's funny. I just canceled Netflix and I didn't even realize that there was a whole transgender thing going on with Netflix right now. I canceled them because they're too damn expensive. And I'm
mhm,
I'm down here in St. Paul and I logged on to watch something the other day and it said, "Oh, you don't seem to be coming from the same IP address as the rest of the people on your family plan." I was like, "Yeah, so it's a family plan. The four members of my family are on it and I pay for it." So
Yeah.
it's
yeah,
like, okay, bye-bye, Netflix.
yeah,
Yeah. So, but this whole idea of control and single points of failure, I think, is really interesting, right? That
hmm,
that we have fewer. I probably half of the books I own now are Kindle, right? Just
hmm,
notwithstanding the bookshelf behind me, and that does, and that's the thing, as an idealist that maybe um, Jaron doesn't address is that if you have a single original that everybody's pointing to,
yeah,
and that's the only thing that needs to be altered in order to change history, right?
yeah,
If we were living in a 1984 world, right, then that would be ideal for them because then they could say, well, all we'd have to do is access that and adjust it so that, we've always been at war with Oceania or whatever.
yeah. That there's a book, The Word Exchange, that runs along those lines. But the book that they're changing is the dictionary.
Hmm.
So everything
Which is what
means
Newspeak
nothing.
does, right? It
It's just
eliminates
like
the dictionary.
yeah, it just leads to complete and utter chaos.
Yeah.
And it was an incredibly good read and really well written. And it was a first novel for
Cool.
the woman who wrote it. And I was
What was
just
that
like, okay,
again?
this is the word exchange.
Oh, okay, cool.
I can get you the author. Just a sec.
Well, I'm picking up a lot of book recommendations today.
It
Apps of
is
Knowledge, The Word Exchange.
Elena Graydon.
Elaine.
Drop it in chat because it has a lot of the same sort of feeling as Robin Sloan's the 24-hour bookstore.
Hmm.
Blanking on that. Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore, which is there's some similar sort of threads along that they sort of traverse upon, and sort of some of the scenes are similar but different cities. And but the word exchange was good. And then there was a book that came out the same time by Max Berry called The Lexicon, where essentially there were certain words that were used as triggers to get people to do things.
Hmm.
And people were like leaving cities and other things because there were certain people that had been predisposed to um, not be zombies, but essentially change their mindset just when a certain word or set of words
Like
were
little,
said.
little Manchurian candidates.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool, cool. Yeah, it's well, and then apparently this week was also the week of the big people sort of recognized a problem at Wikipedia, which I think has been around for a long time, and I don't think that people have been unaware of it, but apparently it hit the mainstream commentariat this week that there's a banned list of sources on the conservative side that
Hmm.
that
Yeah,
Wikipedia.
well, there's ban lists of folks on all sorts of sides,
Yeah.
and it's easy to get into that.
Mhm.
I tried editing my own entry many years back, um, and in sort of the early days of Wikipedia, and I got scolded heavily, and that account got locked, and so I
All
set
right.
up another account.
Because you're not a secondary source for your own life.
Right. There was something incorrect, and I was quoting something that was out there that I didn't write,
Yep.
um, to correct something that was in there. I'm just like,
Mm.
okay.
Yeah,
And then
thankfully,
there was a bunch of stuff
I
that
do
changed
not
over the
have a
years.
Wikipedia. For a while there, I sort of wished I would have a Wikipedia uh, page, but
It,
I do
Well,
not have one.
that's
I'm probably better
that's
off.
a tough part though sometimes is they, if you do original research and you can
yeah,
back it up with
Hmm.
other
yeah,
things, they don't like it. But if it's published in a book, let's say, in fact, this book, Jaron Lanier's book, would
yep.
fall to the level of, okay, this is Wikipedia citable, but
Hmm.
his sourcing is maybe iffy at times at best, or just doesn't exist.
Hmm.
But Wikipedia will take his word as a source and you can quote him because it's a book, yet no one fact check this book the way you might even a magazine article.
Right.
Yeah.
Wired magazine publishes something. Somebody at Wired fact checks and kind of verifies whatever the thing happened was, which is why issues like glass making things up in, the early 2000s is a problematic issue for,
Hmm.
was it the New Republic, I think at the time. But,
Good photo of you, but you're kind of backlit.
it's
Hmm.
you d- what's a good source or what's not a good source. And the thing that's hilarious to me is like my kid, as we discussed these things recently, oh, I can't use the encyclopedia as a source. I
Hmm.
need to use other things. And so here's now the encyclopedia saying these sources are not if you're going to say bad things about the encyclopedia for centuries, well, now the
Yep.
encyclopedia is telling you here's sources that can't be used.
Right.
Yeah.
But yes, there are sources both on the left and the right that are just horrible sources for like active truths
Hmm.
unless you're using those things as because the cultural anthropology of reading Breitbart to follow along how is this magazine or newspaper creating identity in a group of people who read it? That's, to me, that's fascinating.
Hmm.
Hmm.
In which case, Breitbart is a great source
Yeah.
for that kind of material. But what is it? What is the thing you're looking at a good source for?
Hmm.
Hmm.
Is really the question, and critically, almost no one asked that question except
Right.
maybe us, and probably us as a group doesn't ask it often enough either.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And to go back to that whole idea of filtering, right? 10 minutes ago or so, when we were talking about that, the thing that sort of jumped to my mind was of filtering in terms of, the fax blast, right? And you only
Hmm.
need to get, less than 1%, to make money, or 1% to make money, and at 2% you're raking it in. It's kind of weird because you do manage to sort of select a prospect pool in a situation
Hmm.
like that, right? I mean, I remember my first job out of college, I was, selling mutual funds to regular, people across the kitchen table. And so there's a lot of cold calling involved, right? And also a lot of recruiting of people. It was like almost a pyramid plan, right? So I was recruiting. So one of my recruits, one of the guys that I was training up, was from a kind of a wealthy family, and he was for,
Hmm.
he was a recent college grad and stuff. And so he came in with this machine that had two tape recorder, had two cassette tapes, right? And you connected it to the phone lines, and it would dial, and then you gave it a list of a range of numbers, and it would dial all the numbers. And when somebody picked up, it would play from the one tape. And then if they
Hmm.
responded, it would record to the second tape. So basically, you could have a recorded cold call message, and 99% of the time you would, people would either just hang up, or they would say something nasty to you or whatever. But the one out of 100 that would respond positively to that was a much more qualified prospect. So there,
Hmm.
there's an element of selection of. I mean, it reminds me kind of the, these are the good leads, the Glengarry leads. Well, the Glengarry leads,
Hmm.
all they are bingo postcards, right? Where somebody, somebody ripped a thing off of a mailer and said, okay, send me some information. And then they're going to send a sales rep in to talk them into buying the swamp land or whatever it is.
Hmm.
Um, but
Well,
Yeah.
those thresholds are important too. And if I remember, I want to say it's Thomas Schelling in the early 70s wrote a paper about segregation and what level does segregation need to happen to cause ill effects. So if
Mhm,
I'm living in a neighborhood and an African American family moves in and I'm just racist enough to make that the trigger that means I leave,
mhm,
you only need about 15% of people to respond that way to see dramatically ill effects to what happens to neighborhoods to have big shifts.
mhm,
And I think roughly that same 15% number is also this roughly the same number of like hard-boiled Trump loyalists that give Donald J. Trump the power that he has
mhm,
is that 15%. And there's just enough other people in the gray margin beyond that, much less the people,
Hmm.
the people who identified as, Christian right, Christian nationalists, and or just Republicans in general
mhm.
from that time.
Yeah. Well, and then there's that other thing, and I think Graeber cited it at one point, right? The whole, it only takes 3 to 5%, of the people to change, the inertial, momentum,
Yeah.
right? And I think he probably cited a study that was looking at, the shift in ideas about gay marriage or something, right? And it's sort of explaining how it went from, seemingly never going to happen, to obviously going to
Yeah.
happen in a really short period of time.
The
Yeah.
Karl
Well,
Rove, the Karl Rove, like working with evangelicals, because they normally had voted Democratic. And in the 80s, he started working with them and with the pastors and got them starting to shift. And that started sort of the Blue South and a, that sort of him working with the pastors on evangelical churches started flipping the South from blue to red, which was really interesting. And I keep on, when I found that when you mentioned that you were looking at just sort of the influence of churches and politics, that was the first thing that started coming to mind
Hmm.
because it has, and Rove has talked about it a little bit, and then trying to remember the guy who was before Rove, who was Bush and Reagan's. Another one of them was from Texas, Terry something, I think. But he was also doing that same sort of thing and looking at just sort of how we can, where we can sort of push at the edges to start essentially getting people that had influence and then being able to push messages through.
Hmm.
And pastors are, you know, going to grad school in public policy. It's also one of the sort of core things is figuring out how communication works.
Hmm.
How can you change, immunization rates or better health rates, all sorts of things, and who in the community has trust and value for getting a message out.
Hmm.
When AIDS was kicking off within the African American community, they started working with the messages were just not hitting. And the one place they found that people had trust was in the barbershop and the hair salons. And the person who took care of their hair was heavily trusted. So that's who they targeted was the barbers and the hairstylists. And all of a sudden the message started getting out that here are the things that you need to do to keep yourself safe. And like the health shift started taking off. But until they figured out who could be trusted,
Hmm.
it was really difficult.
Yeah, that kind of overlaps with Malcolm Gladwell's kind of
Yeah.
thesis about how things spread through society.
Yeah.
Who are
Tipping
the
point.
real
Yeah.
influencers?
Yeah.
Even though everybody now, every Tim is an influencer, he's just not making enough money, to quit his day job.
Our Tim? The other Tim?
All the Tims.
All the Tims. Yep.
I
Yeah. The
mean,
tipping point book.
Dan, you're an influencer,
Yeah, I influenced like 100 people.
what everybody knows about the axial age is because of you.
Yeah, that's funny. What 100 people know about the axial age is because of me. Yeah, that's
Oh, your open rates are that high?
um yeah, but that doesn't yeah, my open rates are in the yeah are relatively high, but who knows how long
Hmm.
people look at something once they've opened it.
Yeah. Well,
I suppose
that's why it's better. That's why it's better to have the class of, 20, 30 students, and then you know something snuck into their brains because they sat there for an hour.
they're trapped in the room, right? And
Yeah.
then when I take attendance the next day, I actually pass around a bunch of cards and I ask them a question just to see if
Hmm.
they remember,
Yeah.
some little
Cool.
detail about the day that we had
Yeah.
previous. But yeah. So in the I kind of backtracked. I just as I was listening, I kind of backtracked to, back to chapter 16 because I had started the page at
Hmm.
19. And it did seem like, kind of a continuation of the Ted Nelson story. And
Hmm.
then in 19, 20, 21 and stuff, he starts to get into these maybe things that might be something to work
Yeah.
on, universal retention of provenance information, which he wants to tie to um, some type of commercial right that would entail, a micropayment or something like that. Is that
Yeah. It was
still, you think that's still the state of the art as far as potential solutions goes, or has there been any development
no, it
a decade
so
since?
it this section of reading like the like part of it was he's using sort of the first wave of economics understandings, but not a good understanding of it. It's just very thin. And I just kept on running into all sorts of holes. I'm just like, the next step, and I'm like, and then he would just sort of go with it. I'm like, oh, you're missing the other pieces.
Yeah.
And the other piece of it was sort of time has not really
Yeah.
helped him well.
Yeah.
And I kept on having to go back and look at the when he wrote it, and sort of the tech community without an understanding of sort of micropayments. And the micropayments, a lot of it came out of sort of early 2000s with microcredits around mostly in Africa and India.
Right. I remember
And
that.
that
Yeah.
worked.
Somebody got a
Yeah.
Nobel Prize for that, didn't they?
Yeah. Yep. And that worked really well. But when you've got sort of microcredit and micropayments, when you're making nothing and the economy is low,
Right. And
it's
everybody's only earning
relatively
$2
easy.
a day. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now you look at YouTube and you're getting micropayments for, you know, for if you're lucky enough to get any ad revenue,
Right.
you're getting micropayments. You
Yes.
get a million views and you get $53.
Right.
And it's just like, it's sort of that same, you really can't make a living that way. And then he brought up sort of being able to take, you know, a, the Siren server gets 50%, the creator gets 50%. And it's sort of went that way, but not the way that he was predicted. So if you're in that lucky enough group to get ad payment, that you've got enough people, which is something like 5% or 6% of YouTube. And until recently, TikTok didn't pay any of its folks.
Yeah.
But it all sort of turned into sponsors. So sponsors will work directly with creators. And if you've got enough viewers, and it's usually the people who are
And they're the type of
lucky
people
enough
who
to
will
get
buy
ad revenue.
AG1. Yeah.
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 It's the AG1, NordVPN, and a slew of things, except if you're watching finance stuff. And then because those pay insanely well, the sponsorships on those, and it's just, which is sort of the same as on the ad revenue side. And it's like, depending on what you're doing.
Yeah.
But it's like things sort of echoed, but it is still an elite that it's happening to. It is not everybody. And part of that distribution cycle is a bit naive, because the technologist thinking that micropayments were going to solve things was a lack of understanding of just sort of how markets work. And
Well,
part
the
and there
other
was one
piece was, how do you account for it all? Because the cost of
yeah
the accounting is so high.
bingo
The
yep
friction of doing the accounting
Right.
yep
is,
Yeah. Yeah. There
yeah
was
and
there was an interesting, I thought I just put Neil Stephenson's book Fall, or
mm,
Lodge in Hell, which was a
yeah
novel about virtual reality, basically. But and living in virtual reality, and how ultimately at the end, of course, the big reveal is that we are living in virtual reality. But
mm,
that was but along the way, there's this really kind of interesting sort of side plot that he develops of one of the characters before she dies and ends up in this virtual
mm,
world. Develops this kind of trusted naming system, and
mm,
it's initially about names and trust on the internet, but ultimately it becomes this whole kind of platform on which they build this kind of virtuous network of payment and attribution and things like that. And it almost seemed like he had like he should have like written a white paper and just, and kind of, because you have to kind of go in there and look and read very carefully to kind of parse the idea that
mm,
he's developing there. But it was an interesting kind of idea.
yeah
the quirky part
yeah
too is when you look at the economics of YouTube versus Hollywood.
hmm
In Hollywood, roughly the studios are taking a 30% distribution cut. So if you make a movie on
hmm
your own, you self-finance it and you bring it to Warner Brothers to distribute, they'll want essentially 30% of the cut to
I would
do
have
it.
guessed it had
yeah
been more.
Whereas you look at, depends on who you are too. If you're Spielberg,
Yeah.
which is why Spielberg started his own studio. And then it all goes back into his pocket.
Hmm.
Um, but if you're YouTube, the cut's closer to 98%. They're taking almost all of it.
Right.
And they're
Mhm.
letting out just enough of it so that the couple dozen really biggest players look like they're making millions with the
Yeah.
Absolutely.
teams. And what you usually don't see or hear is the team of 20 people working on that channel to make that couple of million.
Hmm.
Um, and then but it's just enough. And he talks about these numbers of who's getting kind of what cut. I don't think he does it as clear cutly as he could,
Right.
because this
Yeah.
would be a great example, and I don't think I remember seeing it.
No, no,
Yeah.
but
Um, but
it's
it's
maybe it sort of developed, after he wrote, if not published the book, right? Because,
Yeah.
it
yeah,
does seem like
yeah.
it is in the last 10 years that, like
Well,
people,
I think that
Ali
that
Abdaal, just kind of
yeah.
became
Those
Yeah.
huge.
distribution numbers were wide enough, even I think in 2013. But easily by 2010, 2011, it was that cut was developing.
Mhm.
Uh, I'd have to go back to my notes to see exactly when I laid it out, but I did some research in the early space, because having worked in Hollywood and knowing what those distribution numbers were.
Hmm.
But and when you see things like haul videos and unpacking videos become a thing.
Right.
Well, oh, I could have an audience and I could make money too as an average Joe. But the other imbalance you see too is the ability to make a good high quality video, even in a short form like a TikTok or a Vine or, you
Yeah.
know,
All you need is
the
the
those
iPhone 17 Pro.
or Reels, it's fairly easy now. You've got most of those tools in your pocket,
Yeah.
but the problem is you see almost no one, even with these professional grade tools. You could make a feature-length Spielberg-esque film, at
Yeah.
least a drama or maybe a comedy, and strip out all the high-end special effects that you might need to put out what Hollywood is putting out. But
Right.
you could make a really high quality film for super cheap, but there
Mhm.
is no one in America or the influencer space right now making the equivalent of the Brothers McMullen,
Hmm.
It
which
so
is one of the first movies that kicked off the big shift in indie
yeah.
filmmaking in the early 90s.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Like he made that movie for a shoestring budget
Right.
and
Yeah.
got big distribution and created a career for himself. Where he is now, I don't
Yeah.
know. But
Right. Well,
He's still
it is
making
kind of,
films, but
no one's
he
doing
followed
long form, in-depth content and or making money on it. And that the
yeah.
question is why? Why is
Yeah.
everybody focused on making
Mhm.
a 10-second reel?
Well, it is kind of a
Yeah.
form-based
So
content
For
thing, right? So the
quick,
so the form, I mean, when you think about the what was it, 320 lines that you got on
yeah.
TV,
yeah.
versus 4K right now. So certainly, yeah, anybody with their iPhone, even if it isn't the most recent one, can make something that is infinitely, technically better in terms of, visual and sound quality. But that doesn't mean they've got an idea.
Yeah. Well, developing
Yeah.
the ideas, expanding it, and the time it takes to do that. I mean, at the quickest level, it takes Hollywood a minimum of 2 years to spin something up and that's when you're rushing into production
Mhm.
because you got big money on the line. You know, from the time you buy Harry Potter as a novel to the time the first movie comes out, usually a 2 or 3 year time span. Um, and that may make a multi-billion dollar cottage industry, or it may just be a, $40 million flop.
Mhm.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
one area, so Nebula Channel or
Yep.
service,
Mhm.
they've been making like their top revenue services that draw folks in. That's all made on iPhones, jet lag, and then they've got a bunch of different. They've taken top creators from YouTube, essentially brought them into Nebula to do either exclusive content, either short form to 30-minute. They've got 3 or 4 hour and a half movies and segments that are all produced relatively inexpensively, and they're
Uh-huh.
getting 30% to 50% cut of revenue.
Oh,
And
is that what they're getting?
yeah,
Hmm.
so it's
And they're getting it. I mean, Nebula's a monthly subscription,
yeah,
right?
it's monthly, yearly, so it's like 30 a year,
Okay.
which isn't bad, but they've
Yeah.
got over a million, it's like a million or 2 million subscribers now.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and they've got I think 40 to 60 different um, uh, folks that are in there.
Mhm.
Um, and if you're not doing it exclusive to them, then you're usually doing it like a day to a week ahead of time.
Mhm.
So it's Nebula first, no ads.
Mhm.
Um, and but a lot of the content that's being created is all off of iPhone, lightly edited in Final Cut, and it ends up being really good quality.
Mhm.
And it's entertaining, cheap to make content
Mhm.
for the most part. But they've got like game shows, all sorts of different stuff that they've got running on there.
Yep. Yep.
And
Like
so it's
I actually I looked at it a while back.
yeah.
I don't know if and there are people who yeah, I don't know that they've made the most of their opportunity on YouTube yet. Like I'm thinking
Yeah.
Lindsay Nicole, right? Who's I think in your neck of
Hmm.
the woods, Chris, and she does biology and archaeology kind of content. Or Milo Rossi, Mini Minuteman, right? He does art, sort of archaeology and he debunks pseudo archaeology, which is which and so he made his he kind of made his mark first on TikTok, I think, swearing at people who were posting, alien aliens built
Oh
the,
yeah.
the pyramids kind of conspiracy theories. And then he actually started creating, sort of legitimate content. He was the first person who was invited. Graham Hancock went to Göbekli Tepe, but only waved at Karahan Tepe, and Milo was actually invited to go to by the Turks somehow to go to Karahan Tepe, and he was the first person to bring a. He was the first, or at least he
Hmm.
said he was the first archaeologist to bring a film crew in there, and probably the film crew was working um, with iPhones or Canon
Yeah.
cameras or something. But yeah, it was. But I don't think that I don't think that either of those two. Maybe Lindsay is on her way to Nebula, but that
Yeah.
would make sense, right? Because
Yeah.
she's going back to the cheetah rescue in wherever in Africa that she was, and
Hmm.
right, making little documentaries about that and stuff. But it does seem like there needs a path needs to develop, right? For
Well, you
Yeah.
you
for
you
people who
also
want to
don't
do
see
more serious stuff.
but you also don't see the shift from that kind of small level creator space into like big mainstream media.
Mhm.
So a rare instance even happened this week where there's a guy, Michael the librarian, who's been doing local
Oh, right.
library
He's going to do Reading Rainbow.
who's going to do Reading
Huh.
Rainbow. And but
Yep.
even at that, and Reading Rainbow is a fairly low key,
Right.
limited distribution. It's not a multi-million dollar platform
Mhm.
type of thing.
Well, and
Yeah.
it
But
actually might be strategically a good idea for PBS at this point because it's something that can live
Yeah.
equally on streaming and on, kind of their network affiliates and
Yeah.
maybe help them make that transition.
we
And
don't.
PBS.
So you in media, you also would see, 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, there was a shift and it started happening really, I think the where I would put the pin in the shift was uh, um what the hell's his name? Third Rock from the Sun, John Lithgow.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
And John Lithgow was a movie only guy. You could not hire, there was a wall in between movies and TV, really, and you
Mhm.
could not go between it and it was rare to do both. So there were not a lot of Hitchcocks who were kind of like doing movies and TV both.
Yeah.
Um, but John Lithgow was like, I'm at the age of my life. I've got a family. I want to stay local. Okay, I'll take a boatload of cash and I'll do it. I'll do a TV show.
Hmm.
And suddenly, for about a decade, you see a whole bunch of movie only actors who will do TV
Hmm.
to now where it's streaming and you'll see Jude Law
Yeah.
doing a TV show
Yeah.
because, or
Hmm.
even a limited series because,
Yeah.
hey, this is what we do now.
Right.
But you
Yeah.
don't see there, so there seems to be a big wall between the content creators and the mainstream media, the t TV and
And then,
movie industry. There,
Right.
so you've got
there's not that thing.
Greta.
Whereas, 20 years ago, you'd see a bunch of commercial and video directors using that as a platform to get into big movies and TV. So, like David Fincher is a good example. He comes,
Hmm.
he does commercials, he does some videos, and then boom. Or you go to film school and you get your film school degree and you make a short film, and that is what parlays you into the big thing. But
You've got
you don't see
there's a
it.
lot of examples of what you're saying doesn't exist because you've got Greta Gerwig who started on YouTube and she's did Barbie after that was like her fourth
Right.
movie or fifth movie, but there's like 15 or 20 of that class and cohort in YouTube of around 2010, sort of around the 2 or 3 years after Casey Neistat, and they were all hanging around that same community, and Casey was hanging out with them, and they were all building content, and they are all either making producers of TV shows, directors of TV shows, and or movies right now,
Yeah.
and they are the ones that everybody is seeking out because they know what connects.
Yeah.
Well,
And
that was at the border of when that was still possible because
yeah,
Hollywood was
it
still using feeder systems of film schools and
yeah.
film festivals to feed that stuff.
Mm.
But since then, there was almost a hard break roughly right after that
There's
when
still some
YouTube
yeah.
has held on to those people
Hmm.
to keep making the small lowbrow content rather than jump up.
Right. I tried to put a link
It yeah.
to Lithgow's Manatee book, and
Mm,
the link won't work. But he was a madman, right? He
mm.
did these. He wrote these little books, and he sang the songs and did the audio of them. So he was very out of his. He was out of the Hollywood box. One of the things that I don't know if it relates directly to this, but that Duran, talks quite a bit
Hmm.
about along the way is anonymity. And
Hmm.
and we've had different I don't know. I guess over time my I mean may I shouldn't say we. Over time my sort of thoughts about anonymity on the web have changed.
Hmm. Yeah, it there's a couple of things that just sort of tie to it's right about the time where blockchain was taking off. Because by I think the first blockchain project I worked on, which actually needed it, was around 2010, about 2010 or so. But it just gets computationally expensive. And the two pieces that it sort of ties to is one gives you enables anonymity in a way, and then also does the connecting of ownership of rights and so forth. And the one that I was helping out was BitTunes, which essentially you did your contract for how the money is split up for the artist and people involved. And as money came in, and it was all Bitcoin, and I think they had two other uh, coins that they accepted, and they would just sort of split it up, and there was no middleman. It was just artists producing things, and if you bought something off of BitTunes, the money was distributed. The tough part was just sort of the computational expense of running blockchain.
Hmm.
But it's still doing fairly well. It didn't take off in mainstream, but it took off in large parts of Africa. It's still running, and it's going really well there as well as in subcontinent of Asia, in like Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, as well as Vietnam. And so it some of the things that he talks about are sort of there, but as Chris pointed out, the accounting is like really expensive to do.
Hmm.
And it's just computationally really expensive, and there's a lot of friction to be able to do it and do it well. And it's like it's one of the things that doesn't that adds friction as you scale. And it just gets very complicated at times. And sort of tied to that is sort of that anonymity. The more that you're involved in the system, the more easy it is to figure out who somebody is.
Mhm.
Um, and particularly across systems. And it's, you know, fingerprints and footprints, you know, the more that you leave your fingerprints and the more that you leave footprints, it's easier to track and you become more and more unique. And it becomes easier to go, this is exactly who this person is.
Mhm. Yeah.
And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or are we we seem to be in an era when the guy who would stand on the street corner in your tiny town and put a
Hmm.
soapbox up and yell at the
Yeah.
wind can now be an influencer at the level of a Charlie Kirk.
Mhm.
And is that a good thing or is it a bad thing?
Yeah.
If you want
Yeah.
to yell at the wind and you're able to make multiple millions doing it or influence, national elections in
Yeah.
first world countries,
Mhm.
Yeah.
do we
Well,
don't see we don't see those people in Russia. We don't see them out of Brazil, or maybe just culturally because they
It,
speak the languages.
it,
We're just not aware of them, but
it, I don't know that there's much of a difference between what's happening in Russia and what's being said by some of the folks in, here. It's a lot of the same words and they're coming from Russia.
yeah.
Um, and
Well,
it's
it
like
depends
that's
on
where
what
they're
the
being sourced
consequences
from.
are, right?
Yeah.
We talk
well,
we now nowadays we're talking about consequence culture, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe there is, Thomas, as you were saying, knowing, being able to kind of figure out who somebody is,
Yeah.
but still, but still allow them, kind of plausible deniability
Yep.
is is meaningful and valuable, in a place
Yep.
where, people are paying attention to the law, right? And
Yep.
less so in, in the Soviet Union where they're just gonna, send the secret police out to shoot you in the head, which actually kind of brought my mind back to the former FBI director that we were talking about,
Yep.
who I think, probably, I haven't been following it, but my guess about that is he probably did a lot of the bad things that they are claiming that he did, but probably not the perjury, because he was smart enough to use qualifiers like "I think" and "as I recall" and stuff like that, where they won't be able to kind of pin him down. So he will have
It,
some level of an out, or
yeah.
some of plausible deniability there.
Yeah.
Um,
Some of the things that
while at the
they,
same time, people will know that he, damn well was behind a lot of the stuff that he
so
was behind.
they ended up picking up an awful lot of things because they were essentially monitoring Russians in the US and folks just walked into those meetings who shouldn't be there and they're like, wait. And I'm like, it's, the things that they were catching were because people were doing things they shouldn't be doing. And it's like they were monitoring things they were legally allowed to monitor and
Uh-huh.
keep track of, and
Yeah.
stuff that was handed off from CIA.
Uh-huh.
And they're like, hey, this is now happening in the US. Can we coordinate on this? We've got Russians that are, having meetings, giving money.
Uh-huh.
And, Trump's
Yeah,
folks were walking into the meetings.
right. Which
And
is,
they're like, okay, you
yeah,
know, we got them on camera, we've got them recorded. We are now tracking them because we need to track them because we're trying to figure out what the Russians are doing and show that the Russians are trying to influence.
uh-huh.
And I'm like, we've got evidence of exactly what's going on because these folks stepped into things that we were monitoring. We
Yeah,
were not going after them. They came to, fell into our trap
yeah.
for the other guys.
Right.
yeah.
Which is weird. I mean, which is kind of a weird space,
Yeah.
serious, law enforcement, or, or crime prevention or anti-terrorism
Yeah.
or anything to be working in, right? I watched the first couple. I didn't pay for them, but I watched the first couple of the episodes of what's his name, Tucker, debunking 9/11, and
Hmm.
which is not really what he's doing, but what seems to be coming out of that is that there is I think ultimately the thesis is that the CIA was aware of a bunch of these people who were coming, were traveling around the world, and they're tracing, where they went
Yeah.
from, to Kuala Lumpur and then Tunisia and then yada yada yada. And and then they came into the US, but apparently, and they're not going to, and they're not going to let him off. I mean, Tucker's not going to want to let him off the hook for this. But it seems like the story behind the story is that the CIA was aware of these people and was tracking them and was trying to develop
Hmm.
inroads into Al Qaeda because they had no,
Yep.
they had no direct kind of connection, and they were thinking, well, these people are relatively harmless if we can, if we can kind of keep track of them and turn one of them, but
Yeah.
they weren't high enough on their radar. I mean, it's easy with 2020 hindsight to say, well, they should have been, telling the FBI about this,
Yeah.
but they didn't tell the FBI about it because they didn't think these guys were
Yeah.
that dangerous, and they wanted
Yep.
to, kind of develop an asset, which
Yep.
is, you know, kind of, I don't know. I don't know the law, and I don't, but it just seems to me common
Yeah.
sense in terms of common sense that is, not as nefarious as the other
Yeah.
more extreme interpretation. Oh, this was a false flag. The CIA was trying to, to start, Wolfowitz and Cheney's war, or any of that
Yeah.
stuff, that
Yeah.
more extreme
Yeah.
interpretations
The
of.
communication between intelligence communities before 9/11 was really poor.
Mhm.
Everything was bunkered,
Right.
and shared knowledge even within, because there's 16 different intelligence agencies, not counting FBI,
Mhm.
but like watching outside of US borders.
Right.
And probably about 5 years after they started building Intellipedia, where you were taking the 16 agencies and building, wikis. They had a local instantiation of Google Earth,
Mhm.
so everybody could look at the same thing and go, at this location, who's got information on what's going on.
Mhm.
You
Right.
had,
Well, and apparently the
blogs,
CIA
all
was
sorts of
using
things.
was using Saudi intelligence in the US to try to keep
Yeah,
track of these guys, right? So,
yeah. And
yeah.
so it's, if you've got people coming in from outside and there are outside resources, you can follow them when they come in
Mhm.
from the CI or any of the intelligence communities.
Yeah.
If it's homegrown, then it's FBI.
Mhm.
But if they're on US soil, then you can also bring in the FBI to say, hey, can you monitor? And part of it is resources, because the intelligence communities don't have many resources in the US to do that tracking. They're all global.
Mhm.
And so it's they're out elsewhere. And so the FBI will get called in and say, hey, can you
Mhm.
keep track of these folks, do things, and they'll coordinate. And that coordination was sort of really rough. And that was one of the things, I think Intellipedia was like the third or fourth attempt after 9/11, because others just, the people who, there was people that were still trying to keep things separate and not realizing how they could do
Mhm.
it,
Right.
you know,
Right. Right. So there was,
keeping
yeah, so
clearance
there was the
levels, all sorts of
logistical,
different
right.
things.
There was the logistical failure. Apparently, the
Yep.
other thing that they're claiming in this little, documentary that Carlson is
Yep.
making, that they didn't even have, they couldn't scan the photos of these guys even
Yeah.
after 9/11. They didn't have
Huh.
scanners. They FedExed photos of the people around, and stuff like that, just, and so
Uh,
they didn't
yep.
have a functioning email system that FBI agents had access to. And I don't know if
Hmm.
that's 100% true, or if there's a way in which
It,
it's true, but but there does seem to have
Oh,
been.
it can't be true because Hillary was running that email server out of her house.
That's why she was, right? Because they well, and it's kind of funny because, I mean, remember 6 months ago, when Doge went into the federal government, saying, oh, all this shit is in, COBOL and Fortran, and
yep.
running on servers that don't talk to each other and all of that. So,
And they don't talk to each other by law.
right. Yeah.
And there is reasons, really good reasons, why they do not talk to each other.
Yeah.
And there's also really good reasons why they still run on COBOL and, Pascal, other stuff,
Yeah.
because it works, it's efficient, and it's more efficient than the modern pieces, and it
Oh,
scales.
even in commercial systems, because I've got a friend who works for a major airline,
Hmm.
They are still using some of the oldest computer technology and
Yep.
code on the planet. And
Hmm.
he stays employed because he knows how to use it and how to do it and
Yep.
trains everybody new who comes in to do all this stuff. And
Yeah.
he's like, we could easily update it and upgrade it all, but it would be hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And he's
Yep.
like, their margins just are not big enough to
Yep.
Well,
cover
yeah,
those upgrades. There's no real value in doing it. So the
right.
systems stay old and we just keep piling duct tape and baling wire on top of the whole thing to keep it running.
Right. Right. Well, and they, the industry
So it's not,
that
you can't even say that commercial interests would drive the change in innovation
right.
because,
Right. But and
or if you
also
could.
there was a different ethos, of course, too, right? So to go back to what, Jaron, likes to talk about, the early days of the Silicon Valley, right? The whole, and it wasn't initially in the hardware boom era quite as much of a move fast and break things
Yep.
ethos, but it was a little bit of one, right? And
Yep.
I do remember, the first my first taste of that business was, I worked for a clone shop where we built, 286s and then 386s and then 486s.
Hmm.
And, and at the time, my wife at the time was working in IT for Norwest, which became Wells Fargo. And so
Yeah.
so she was in the operations center, where they had IBM 360s and, and she was talking to, and she had been there long enough that she remembered, core memory and, and
Hmm.
DASD and, all of these concepts that that I was like, what? And so, but it was mission critical and stable and
Yep.
and all of those things that the PCs that they were building in the room next to me, and the way I was running the sales department, and the production department was next door in this old warehouse building, where we burned them in because it was just hot in the room, so we just let them run
Yeah.
overnight. um, uh, and there were, and there were, so yeah, there's a whole different um, idea about, um, which is not to say that IBM didn't make a lot of huge mistakes, thinking that
Yeah.
that world was going to kind of continue for them, and that
Yep.
and there would only need to be 12 computers in the world. It's Thomas Watson
Yep.
originally said, right? Uh, so yeah. So that all figures into this, this thing. I mean, he's sort of rhapsodizing about, using military grade encryption to, talk about who's going to pay for the pizza. Um,
Hmm.
but that was all enabled by, and so that, kind of playfulness and triviality was enabled by the fact that there was DARPAnet and, military
Yep.
grade encryption and all of these things,
Yeah.
available for them to kind of free ride on. So it's a big free rider
Yeah.
issue, I think that
Yeah.
even,
Well,
Hmm.
even if
It.
you go back and you look at how Bill Gates became Bill Gates, he was a young kid free riding on empty time that he had access to a computer
Yep.
lab
Mhm.
to tinker around and play.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
got to
One of the
be
things.
careful what you do as a living and you let your kid have free access to
Right.
because you fuck up the world.
Yep.
Yeah. There was one of the arguments within Lanier just sort of talking about micropayments and just sort of micro contributions. And it's like if thinking of open source on like GitHub and other things, and it's like most corporations now pretty much all run on open source.
Hmm.
Um, there and most large computer systems or computer packages are all based on open source.
Yeah.
But most open source is, there's no money coming out of it from the people who are contributing for the most part. There are companies who they will pay people to work on open source projects
Hmm.
that are either their own creation or just to help improve them because they're using them.
Hmm.
Um, but it's, you know, that model of people contributing sort of out of their own need to contribute to improve something or to get something out. um, doesn't quite have monetary remuneration.
Yeah.
Well,
Um,
I know a few people who have high-paying day jobs
yep,
in big corporations who are big open source advocates, and in their
yep,
free time as a hobby, they
yep,
contribute
yep,
to a level that they could start their own company if they were
yep,
charging for the side projects they're doing. But
yep,
it's I make enough money from Google or big
yep,
corp XYZ that they are subsidizing my hobby of doing this stuff on the side,
yep.
um, which is a
Yeah,
whole
there's a lot.
But
other.
also, I mean, in that context, this week, Austrian military, i.e.,
Hmm.
part of NATO, chucked out Microsoft Office and put in LibreOffice, which is
Hmm.
a open source.
Yep.
Um, and of course, we all started off with Obsidian, which is, with the odd exception of a plugin, is open source
Hmm.
and free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a second. Obsidian is not open source, is it?
No,
Not even
it's
remotely.
it is partially. So
Chunks of it are, but like the
yeah,
whole thing itself is not. Yeah, I
you
couldn't
can
stand it up and run it.
you can so most of the code for it is openly available. You can't contribute. And
Yeah.
so it's, you know, but they've got a really interesting model. Because when they were charging corporations, but like what they are charging is a relatively small amount. And companies were paying them quite a bit. And they finally, within the last year, said, we don't need corporate contributions anymore to pay.
Hmm.
And more companies started paying when they did that. And the companies that were paying kept paying because they're like, we really like this. We don't want it to go away. But it's only 5 full-time developers. And I think they've got 15 part-time. And I think there's like 6 core part-time. And then the others are even smaller contribution, but it is a really small, lightweight, nimble team
Hmm.
that is building it. And, they're not building something that is trying to do everything. And they're like,
But that's but do everything is where the plugins come in to a certain extent,
yeah,
Hmm.
and virtually all of those are pure open source, and in virtually
so,
have to be
yeah,
because that's where the validation check comes from. There's
hmm.
no Apple Store checking it works,
Hmm.
but
Yeah. It's
it's
kind of funny
particularly
because
when you get things like military countries worth of military chucking out
So,
Microsoft Office. That's just
so part of it is
an,
that
an,
there's enough.
a significant.
So Austria does not have. So if you're looking at sovereignty of running your code, and last company that I worked for, are Europe. Europe has really strong sovereignty rules, and Microsoft does not have many points. I think they've got Italy, France, and Germany, and that is it for running servers. And Austria has, like many European countries, they've got sovereignty laws where anything that is any service that is running needs to be running in our country.
hmm
And Microsoft doesn't run there. And so they can run Libra on servers, run it as a software as a service within Austria and have it meet their needs.
hmm
And there's a lot of things just you know AWS as well as sort of Azure, just sort of where's the data, who has access, how secure is it, all becomes a large question when you're looking at aerospace, military, all sorts of things that people want to keep really secure
hmm
and tight. And there's been an awful lot of move off of even private cloud and gov cloud to more proprietary cloud environments that are run by governments and other things because they know who is touching it, they know who the actors are, and it's beginning to be more and more of a requirement, particularly by governments,
hmm
to be able to have that understanding, and that traceability isn't fully there,
hmm
and particularly with a lack of trust from outside of the US, of US systems. They're like, we are not really comfortable having, you using
Mhm.
something with an entity that we are not trusting right now, and just sort of
Right.
um, government putting its finger down, saying, thumb on the scale, and saying you need to do
Right.
this, and companies are like, okay, we'll do that, and they're like, other
Right.
countries are like, we would like to move off of that system and move out of that environment to something we are more comfortable with.
Well, and especially ever since Brad Smith's book, right? Tools and Weapons.
Hmm.
It was kind of an open secret that
Yep.
Microsoft would roll over to any U.S.
Yeah.
government request and never even alert the object of the surveillance that they
Yep.
were being surveilled, or that they had shared, data on them.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's kind of weird, the whole, that whole what's going on in these, in the either governments or big corporations, that act you know, like nations, like Google.
Yeah. Yep.
Interestingly, I watched, God, somebody posted a really, one of the PKM guys posted a thing on Notebook LM about 2 weeks ago, kind of
Hmm.
a walkthrough. I don't remember who it was, but it was a walkthrough of, a workflow with Notebook LM. And I thought, oh, that looks kind of interesting. And so I got it, and
Yep.
I uploaded a bunch of PDFs to it and asked it to, chunk through them and tell me some things about it and stuff like that. And then, and it told me, well, I had reached my limit of, 53 or, PDFs or whatever. And so I had to buy
Yep.
the service. So I did. So I got in
Huh.
the 1 month free, and then we're going to charge you $300 or whatever deal. And and it and then what I wanted to do was I wanted to, I had, over the years, over the, decades, I've collected a bunch of, old history articles and old primary sources. And so I wanted to, kind of process through all that and find some, try to find some insights, try to compare some things. And I thought that might be kind of promising. But what it did actually was a bunch of the stuff that I had loaded up to it was in the form of PDFs that I had downloaded out of Google Books, right?
Hmm.
So, full length books
Yep.
that they had scanned. And that it used to be, and they're probably not available anymore, but they were available, back when Google Books was shiny and new. And so I had downloaded them, and they told me that was a no-no. They told me they were not going to process anything that came from that type of a source. And
Huh.
so I canceled it. I was like, well, what the hell good are you to me then?
Yep.
This was a project that Google, supposedly did to make the information of the world available to everybody. And then they create this Notebook LM, which is also supposed to, make insights about the information of the world available to everybody.
Yep.
But no, not
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Have used it sort of off and on to test it over time. And it pulls things, you will give it documents, give it a domain and a wrapper of use this as your context. And it still pulls things from outside,
Mhm,
um, and brings things in that are not necessarily germane to that argument or counter to it.
mhm.
And because I fed it some of my own work and it was making statements, I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not in what I wrote.
What I said.
And I'm like, I got really nervous, and it wasn't. I didn't
Mhm,
write that. It was pulling it from somewhere else, and it was counter. And I wrote, my pieces because people were going off in the wrong directions on things. I'm like,
mhm.
it is not this. This is not what this stuff is. This is how it works, how it functions, the bounds of it. And yet it just sort of willfully went, hey, it does this stuff, and this is one of the values. I'm like, no, it is not.
Mhm.
And then recently tried it with 12 papers that there's a group of us that have been doing work on boundary spanning roles and objects and understanding boundary crossing, and which is an area I've done work over the last like 25, 30 years or so, and just have an awful lot of, sort of checklist of going in, and like anytime you're doing any boundary crossing, whether it's team to team, organization to organization, country to country, whichever, there's rough checklists that you go through.
Hmm.
Is this a concern? How are we going to handle it? Who's going to own what? How do we, deal with things? Is it an issue? Is it not an issue? If not an issue, don't do it. And then you come back after that quick triage of an hour or two of going through it, and then you do the deep dives. But it saves you tons of time later on. And I was like, okay, let me see the academic research and what it comes up with in Notebook LM. And I had to do a mind map because the elements that I have for my own checklist, I had done a mind map of, here are the 9 areas, here are the sub elements that tie to it. And it came up with some, quite a few things. A lot of it aligned with what I had. I'm like, okay, and had read 6 of the documents and research papers very closely. I was like, this is interesting. Set it aside for about a week, went to go back, and it didn't remember the mind map that it did. So I
Mm.
created it again, and it was different. And I'm
Mm.
like, this is not this is not really helpful.
Yeah.
Like,
Might be
I was
different
looking for,
if it were actually if you controlled, you had compiled an instance of Notebook LM and we're
yep,
running it locally.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
assuming
And
assuming
yeah, I
that can even be done.
have a couple things that I'm starting to do that for, and just taking some of my own works, and because I can't remember what I have written, what I have done presentations on, where I've got work product and other stuff from consulting and other things that I've done that
Mhm.
tie back to other works.
Yep.
And I have it all just sort of mapped out for helping people be able to see what their own problems, gaps, and needs are far more clearly rather than jumping to solutions that may or may not apply to whatever they're trying to solve and trying to do. And it usually and helps companies greatly that go through it and save money in selecting correct products and optimizing workflows and processes and so forth. But it's just it being able to map things and being able to hand it off to somebody else to who can help do a facilitation. I'm like, the only way that it works is that it's in my head, and I'm like, that doesn't scale.
Mhm.
And so it's like, maybe notebook LM will work. I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah. It's
I
funny.
like that.
But Jimmy Carr apparently his book must have come out recently, and so he's been on a
Yeah,
tour, and so I've heard him, not just his comedy sets, but I've heard him being interviewed by a couple people recently, and
Yeah.
he's quite an interesting stoic.
Yeah,
huh.
it's interesting. I've seen snippets of a few things, probably because he's in the zeitgeist lately.
Mhm.
But he seems to have some interesting, like deeply rooted philosophical takes on life that are not
Hmm.
he
Yeah.
is not Bill Barr, you know.
Right.
He is Bill Barr in some of his comedy and hot takes, but
Right.
he has some seriously deep read, well thought out philosophies that
Hmm.
especially while he's doing those little segments where he talks back to the audience or he
Mhm.
calls for people to try and, skewer him.
Right.
But he'll like in the middle of a really raunchy comedy set and it's as if he's trying to almost go out and get himself canceled sometimes, which I think is a part of his shtick.
I think
But
so. Yeah.
somebody will say something and he'll be their biggest cheerleader out of like left field, like something he could make fun of. Suddenly he turns the train around and he's got this kindness and empathy and compassion, that just hits me like a frying pan every time he does it. That
Yeah.
like there's something deeper at work here than just this, bathroom humor
Right.
that people came for, which I think is just fascinating.
I
Hmm.
think so too.
You know?
Extremely well read too. I mean,
Yeah.
he will drop the authors and titles of books into not necessarily into his comedy sets, but into conversations with people and I'm just like writing them down. It's like, oh, that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
No. No. So
but it's creating deeper thinkers through bad comedy.
yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, the crowd work is I guess it makes for good it makes for good clips on,
Hmm.
on YouTube or Instagram or, or TikTok or whatever. Um,
But and that's what's interesting too is here's a guy he's got what, 5 or 6 Netflix specials going back
mhm,
almost a decade.
yep.
And I think most of America had broadly never heard of him until the last like 6 or 8 months
Mhm,
when he kind of pushed into it with it. I think he's touring and doing his book and the whole 9 yards, but
mhm. Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Apparently he does like
it's interesting to see how he's
300 plus shows a
structuring
year.
old media and new media all at once.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And apparently has an insane work ethic. Uh,
hmm
so,
Yeah, he's on runs like 2 or 3 panel shows, um, which are really good, and then he's on a bunch of others.
mhm,
Um, then he's got his, comedy tour on top
yep,
of that.
right. Right.
which makes you think too, what is his process? What's his background? How is he generating it all?
Mhm.
And it would be
What
fun to
what does
see it.
what do
I
his
mean,
notes look like?
presumably
He,
he's got a team of people helping him out on all these shows, but to be generating all this stuff on a regular basis and churning it out, I'm sure he's got a social
he's,
person who's cutting up clips of longer
Oh,
things and dropping them into social media on a regular basis. But
yeah, he's
yeah,
got a
I don't
production team
imagine
on.
he's a Final Cut Pro user himself
yeah.
Yeah,
here.
his video stuff. He's got a team that sort of helps put things together. But he's talked about there's a few good interviews with him that have been around like over the last 5 or 6 years or so, and he just reads a ton.
Hmm.
And when he's traveling to different places, like when he's in transit, he reads, takes notes, writes a ton,
Hmm.
writes for comedy, but then also reads and writes for understanding.
Yeah.
Um, and it's really interesting, like how he approaches stuff.
And
Hmm.
I find it
Um,
highly interesting that all three of us, although maybe four, because Tim hasn't said anything about whether he likes him or not, or whether he's even available in, the Middle East. Um, but we all are aware of him, have seen him, appreciate his philosophy, and the
Hmm.
fact that he's well read and doing, and we at least some of us have dug into what is his method.
Yep.
And I had it
yep.
on my to-do list to dig into some of his method.
Mm.
So,
It,
you know.
Yeah.
Obviously, he is striking a chord to a specific subsegment of America, at
Yeah.
least.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
yeah.
apparently, I mean, and it's kind of weird because he apparently has had, his ups and downs too. Apparently, he
Hmm.
nearly, I mean, he got in huge trouble about tax avoidance. Um,
Hmm.
and then yeah, and then but apparently he got past that. It's funny too, though, because he said he started doing 2 shows a night. The seven, like
yeah,
the 7 o'clock show is for the tax man, the 9 o'clock show is for me, sort of thing.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
so
I stumbled on him off of QI, I think. That's where I found out about him. And then from there, just sort of, because he was a regular in the Stephen Fry years of
mm,
QI
mhm.
and just would
I can see how they would like each other.
mercilessly torment Stephen Fry,
Yeah.
um, which was just, it's very funny.
Hmm.
Um, and then stumbled onto, there's 2 shows that are similar. It's like 8 out of 10 cats, and then there's a 8 out of 10 cats countdown.
Mm.
And one is a more serious one that he's not on, and then there is one that is more comedy driven.
Yeah. It's interesting because he does one of the things that I've heard him say is you know, Richard Pryor and George Carlin,
Mm,
sort of, neither of whom he ever met, both, sort of created a world in which he can exist. And he feels very,
hmm
very, very privileged or, he's
yeah,
benefits from that. I don't know if this is probably a bad segue, but to pull it back
yep.
to Jaron, there's a
We'll do
chapter
Jimmy Carr as
25 is
our
on
next book,
risk,
though.
right?
Like book
Yep.
market.
Yeah. Chapter 25 is this risk chapter and the idea of, what do we do about these risk pools once we can actually see much more
Hmm.
in a much more granular way, right? That was one of the, I mean, that was the whole premise behind Tesla auto insurance, right? Was
Right.
that you were going to have a much different risk pool, and so rates were going to be much lower because, you know, FSD was going to eliminate accidents.
Yeah.
You know, was the theory at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. I think by the time I got to the risk chapter, I think he needed to have firmer foundations to get to it.
Mhm.
Um, but also and then also just sort of, it was another one of those things that just sort of fell into time.
Yeah.
Like Airbnb, you know, some of the stuff around Airbnb called out relatively well, but I kept on thinking about just
It
sort
didn't age
of
as well,
what's that?
but the rest of it didn't age as well.
Yeah, trying to think what the other one I was thinking about. Oh, it was Uber and just sort of risk pool and just sort of, um, you know, just sort of how Uber has changed, one from a risk perspective, but then also just sort of what it was founded on. And then talking to some drivers in the last few weeks, they're getting, they used to get about 2/3 of the ride fund, and they're now getting less than half.
Mm.
And costs have gone up to users who are using Uber and Lyft. But Uber US is essentially funding lower cost European Uber to get a foothold there. And it's just,
It used to be illegal.
uh, yeah,
Yeah.
it,
Yeah, well,
uh,
That's
it,
a John Rockefeller strategy.
well,
yeah,
he, here there's two Uber local competitors,
hmm,
Mm.
but the biggest difference between those two is the smoothness of the app that gets you,
yeah,
are you going to the right place, etc. A while back, I had an Uber failure, or the equivalent of an Uber failure. Um, Partly my fault, and partly the system's fault. One of the quirks here is we used to have a J-shaped creek, but natural creek that is what Dubai is built around. We've
hmm,
extended that now, so it's now a U shape. So you can come in one end and go all the way around and get back out to the Gulf.
hmm,
And in the time that that's taken to go up, there've also been a few more buildings that have been built on the new man-made creek.
huh,
So I said to the Uber guy, the equivalent of the Uber guy, Radisson Blue on the creek, because I wanted to go to a particular restaurant up at Radisson Blue. Radisson Blue, fucking bastards, have built a new hotel on the man-made creek.
Ah,
And of course, because it's an Uber style thing, you buy the trip.
mm,
And neither of us noticed that the end point was the wrong place. So from where I was to where they dropped me off was only half the distance because I wanted to go to the far side of the old creek, which would have, if I'd have walked thereafter in a straight line, would have been even a boat trip because
mm.
there's no bridge at that point. And the other thing, of course, is particularly in Europe, there's a lot of pushback on the Airbnb stuff recently, where they're beginning to say, no, we're going to start limiting the number of tourists because the Airbnb structure has raised the price of accommodation such that our kids can't buy a house now.
Mm.
hmm,
So it's not just you can't buy one in the suburbs, you can't buy one in that city at all. It's just too expensive.
Mm.
And it's like here, on the odd few times I've used Uber, I've used Airbnb, most of the time it's a 50-50. I've got a spare flat or I've got a spare room, i.e. the
hmm,
original Airbnb ethos.
Right.
But other times it's like, oh, can you tell me which apartment you're in? No, because you should fucking know because it's Airbnb ethos. And it then turns out what I'm talking to is a management company
Hmm.
who have inserted themselves between Uber and all these owners, such
Yeah.
that they're now managing 30, 40, 50, 100 different properties, such that they're now charging 10, 20% or whatever against the actual owner before Uber gets their Airbnb gets their cut.
Hmm.
So it's sort of, do you like the fact that I've got now a professional face on my Airbnb or not? And
Yeah.
it starts to get difficult because if they are spread across the city, like Dubai, how much local knowledge do you have? As in, where's the nearest 24/7 pharmacy? And it's the only real problem against that is, of course, we're all carrying these things. You
Hmm.
don't need to know. So all that local knowledge that would come from I live here or I live around the corner and you're in my second flat in the same block even, so I know where stuff is, disappears. So what's the difference of me doing that from renting a place from Hilton? And of course, most of the hotel chains have also pushed their price down to get closer and closer to the Airbnb. So therefore, all
Hmm.
the staff of Hilton or whoever chain hotel are not getting the rises, or they're getting worse conditions, or they're not getting the promotions, etc. So is the freedom of saying, I've got a spare house or I've got a spare room, I can let that out safely. How big a benefit? Why satisfying that risk, both financially and in security terms? Why is that a benefit
Yeah.
in the overall scheme of things? Which I don't think he really touches on sufficiently.
Hmm.
Um, but maybe might cover that in his conclusions. Maybe I don't know yet.
Yeah.
Um, but it seems an odd one. What have we? We've already said a couple of similar things. What have we lost by doing it that way? That's a recurring theme all the way through, and a lot of the time we don't know enough. We don't think through the unintended consequences. And the classic story of that was in the mid time, but around the 2000s when I was working in Germany a lot. Germany decided to completely decriminalize prostitution.
Hmm.
The consequences of that, women who were on state benefits started getting the benefits taken away because they'd been to too many interviews where they said no. When they were questioned, in many cases, it's a waitress or it's a bar job. Turns out, no, it's not. It's a lap dancing or it's a full prostitution position, but they're
Hmm.
not advertising it as such.
Hmm.
And so I've said no 5 times on the dot, on the trot, and so I've now lost my benefits. So
Hmm.
the unintended consequences of
Hmm.
seemingly two relatively good things becoming not so good just don't get thought through because the world's too complicated. You know, why why would I go and work for somebody who is using Oracle as opposed to
Hmm.
SAP? Because Oracle's an American, SAP is German, and SAP doesn't really have the same integration to the German government in quite the same way. So I don't want to be visible to the government, and I can work on SAP, but I don't want to work on Oracle. What's the benefit? What's the risk? Etc. Etc. one of them's going to get me on the no-fly list because they're reading my email. One of them's not going to bother. But Germany doesn't have a no-fly list. UK does.
So along the way, he
Norway,
says the golden
Norway
rule might
does.
the golden rule might become hard to distinguish from ambient blackmail if blackmail really becomes ambient enough. So, which struck me as what you were talking about, Tim, with the okay, we're going to make this legal, and then it's going to become normalized, and then we're actually going to require it. What do you mean you're not turning tricks if you're invited to?
Well, it's the same thing for jaywalking. Is Big Automobile in the early 1900s started pressuring cities to institute jaywalking.
Jaywalking here has just had its fine increased. And now they've also made more crossings linked to the traffic lights or new traffic lights.
Yeah.
Such that one particular junction that I used where all the filters were pedestrian crossings with no lights, they've now got lights. And the main crossing is traffic driven, whereas the filters are pedestrian driven. But a lot of people don't recognize it, so they stand there because they know it's no use pushing a button when they're doing the main crossing, so they don't push the little filter, and vice versa. And it's like, why is there 35 people stood on that filter crossing? Have they really waited that long? Yes. So I go up, push the button, it instantly stops, and we all cross. But it's the devil in the detail. I mean, some of the stuff really gets my goat. I mean, one of the shopping malls that I use has recently done like an 18-month project to redo all of the toilets. And they clearly had two teams. The one person that was constant was who selected the art to go on the wall and who does the lighting. Every toilet's now got different lighting. Every toilet has now got different themed pictures.
Perfect.
That's okay.
Variety.
It's excellent. That's excellent. But the two teams doing things like the carpentry, one team has selected a doorknob that's about the size of your thumb with flattened surfaces. So if you're a child or an old person with arthritis or just weak, you could easily lock yourself in. The other team has got one that's got a wing nut like this wide on the same size spindle. It's easy as peasy to get it, unlock it and lock it, right? The downside is it's of no real consequence because we have 100% manned or laded restaurants. So you can always bang on the door and say, let me out. provided you speak the same language as the person doing the cleanup job, which is not a given.
Okay, so there's I don't think I've gone over the edge towards the end. I'm trying to kind of bring us to the end of the section that we're reading today. But he says at one point when he's actually starting to propose solutions, he says commercial rights are actionable, right? Is one of his things, right? And he says once the data measured off a person creates a debt to that person, a number of systemic benefits will accrue. Just for just one example, for the first time, there will be accurate accounting of who has gathered what information about whom. No amount of privacy and disclosure law will accomplish what accounting will do when money is at stake. Okay, so this idea that the value that's created from the data gathered about me, whether it's about my habits, my my medical conditions, or whatever it might be, that I will participate in the value that's created down the chain. I don't think he addresses, and maybe it's just like, oh, because it was, it's farther down the line and he wasn't thinking about it at the time, but there could be vastly different values
Hmm.
created off of a piece of data based on the not necessarily the value of the data, but the quality of the processing that's happening after the data is gathered, right? The questions that are asked about it, the comparisons with other data that are being made, all that kind of stuff, the sophistication of the system, and maybe the stakes of the outcome or whatever, an outcome that saved lives, based on, some quirk of my medical, background, which I never did allow them to do the genetic thing that the hospital wanted to do on me. Uh, but because I figured that would be something that they would participate in and I wouldn't. But even so, I mean, well, what about that? How do we deal with the fact that, that the value that's going to be created downstream of this data that's being collected on, so we're getting nothing for it in the meantime, right?
Hmm.
Isn't necessarily all equal.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And as an example,
Yeah.
no one in Henrietta Lacks's family
Right.
should ever have to work again a day in their lives for
Absolutely.
the next 10 generations
Right.
because and when she was giving those cells, aka
Mhm.
they stole them from her,
Right.
she had no idea and they had no idea what the ultimate value would be.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Um, and that's a hard thing to do, even if you can actually account for the accounting of that data, it's still, would it in this system he is proposing, would that actually be accounted for at a later date? Could
Mhm.
you go back and say, because her current family still has not really been properly, you know,
Right.
compensated for what they're doing.
Right.
Um,
Right. Nor, ironically, have they probably been compensated for all the books that have been written about what was done to her.
yeah.
So there's, I mean, but maybe that's part of the solution is some type of more sophisticated conversation about the fact that it's not necessarily 100% binary, right? That it's that all of the value shouldn't accrue to one place or to the other, but there should be some type of more sophisticated conversation about what was,
Yeah.
which is weird because I mean in economics, right? It's very hard to sort of, I mean, all of our effects are local. I said something in the chat about, about the whole Graeber's
Hmm.
idea about, that the whole point of economics was to sort of localize and anonymize, these things that Jaron is hoping would become more complex and nuanced and non-local and sophisticated. But
He doesn't frame it as such, but in some sense, you could read it that he is asking kind of all of humanity to unionize
Hmm.
against everything,
right,
which would be a useful thing,
right.
whether it's or even in my case this year with insurance and how it happens, there are 4 or 5 massive insurance companies who are all handling this fire catastrophe slightly differently. And I have heard from friends and neighbors because everybody in my entire community has been affected,
Hmm.
whether you totally lost your house and everything in it, or you are in my situation where you were chased away for 4 or 5 months, but you had to
Hmm.
go through a cleaning process. What does that look like?
Hmm.
How is that paid out? But even with sharing some modest information, it's not being shared at a level of the fact that I can sit and easily say, you know what, I'm going to change insurance and I'm going to change from Mercury and go with State Farm or go with whoever it is because I was treated way better. I can't tell how differently my case was treated with the type of insurance I had versus the guy next door.
Right,
But if we all were throwing our data into one pot
right,
and as consumers we're able to look at that or run some numbers against it, or the community as a whole was somebody in the local government could run those numbers for us and say, here's where you're being screwed, or here's where you're losing out, and you might get X, Y, or Z.
Hmm.
Nobody, not
Yeah.
even the big, and there's probably 2 dozen in big law firms have come in to try
Hmm.
and capitalize on the catastrophe.
Hmm.
Even they're not really doing that on behalf of their clientele.
Hmm.
Um, they're aiming at the big pots of money to try and get that out versus I'd rather have a pot of money where I could say, okay, I'm in this situation, or even if it wasn't a big catastrophe and it was, oh, we had a small house fire because the stove was left on.
Hmm.
If the 10,000 of those incidents that have happened in the last decade were compiled in one spot, and I could go look and say, okay, here's what should happen or could happen,
Right.
versus, oh, I have to go look online or I have to chat with 20 people or
Right.
do all this work to figure it out.
And even based on
Yeah.
that, the universal and the particular is still an issue, right? I mean, it could be that when you called in with your kitchen fire claim, you know, you were, you know, you behaved in a way that did not, make you you know, um, that the claims adjuster didn't like you, right? Or that the claims adjuster had just been, gotten a talking to about letting too many through, and it was
Yeah.
time.
Hmm.
The end of the month is coming. It's time to start denying some of these, and get our numbers right, right? There's all these other things that are happening that that
Well,
that are making this not an apples to apples to apples kind of a
Oh,
comparison ever.
Yeah.
well, that all comes
even in the
back
first
to
week of
the
the fire, my insurance guy was like, "Don't file a claim yet. Don't file a claim yet." And I'm like, "Are
Huh.
you kidding? Like 10,000 structures just burned down. We didn't know this at the time, but it was like you should wait until you know there's an actual loss." And I'm like,
Mhm.
Huh.
Yeah. So
well,
so so Jaron says that the correct price of information should be the price at which a siren server can make no money without adding value to the information it has gathered. But the price should not be so high that adding value can't generate a profit. So again, it's like, what do you do with that? Where does that go?
well, you go
Yeah.
you go delay, deny, and defer.
Okay.
well,
Yeah.
but that's the thing though, is why can't the siren server be run by the government on behalf of all of us? And
Hmm.
Yeah,
just
I mean,
and save the profit to the people rather than to some corporation that can do it.
so clearly the insurance company type mode, they're not so much adjusters, but they're what's the other word? But actuaries. Their actuaries know the numbers. They won't share that because it's commercially sensitive
Right.
against their competitor.
Because it gives them a competitive
And it's
advantage over
like
the other insurer. Yeah.
it's
Hmm.
our current clientele mix is this way leaning, and your clientele mix is that way leaning. So is that significantly different for this type of claim? Don't know because they won't tell us because they're not joining the conversation.
Well, and that's
So,
what he was talking about way back at the beginning of the book about how that the ability to crunch through all of this data, and AI is just going to accelerate that and exponentially probably, and find connections that nobody would ever have anticipated, right? Find correlations that may or may not be causal, but at least are still meaningful, right? So then you could say, oh, this group actually has a different risk profile for some ridiculous reason, like they all drink a glass of wine once a week, or but a reason that you don't even have to know. All you have to do is see enough data. And that is, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And we thought we were, for a moment there, it seemed like we thought we were going to get it with language models, right? That that GPTs were going to, because we thought they would all be, they would all be the same and they would learn, and they would all learn from each other and it would lead to this, this generalized, big AI. And
Yeah,
now they're all getting fragmented, right? Because
Mhm.
everybody is, putting fences around their data sets.
but they're also
Yeah.
getting specialists, aren't they? They're all beginning to become insects rather than decent mammals in that context.
Mhm.
And
Well,
yeah,
maybe that'll prevent them from becoming Skynet.
Well, what
well,
happens too is
absolutely. But, there's no T100. If
Right.
if there's no T100, there's no T1000 either.
Yeah.
well, there's always a point at which your electric company or your water company or whoever it is that was a private for-profit concern ultimately becomes a utility.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then it becomes either so heavily government regulated or hey, you can have X amount of, profit built in for running this thing, but it's
Yeah.
regulated and the profit you can take is so minimal.
Right. Right.
When
So,
do we get to the point that internet and services across it become a
yeah.
utility that's regulated that way?
Yep. So we finish the book next time, right? We're kind of out of time, and
Mhm.
I have a student meeting
Yeah,
coming up kind of
there we
soon.
go.
Cool.
So yeah, so whatever it is, part nine, does that begin with seventh interlude? Is that where?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was what it was.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And I think we're gonna run over slightly over 2 hours, even after I take all the ums and ahs out. So well done
Where's the
today,
fun in
guys.
that?
All right. So okay. Cool. Thank you.
Great.
See you
Thanks.
next week.